Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well. It is February of 2025. We've already reached February. More than a 12th of the year is done. What's that, like about 8%, 9% of the year is already done. So hopefully everybody is getting back into the swing of things, getting back into some sort of normalcy for the year. And while 2025 has been a little bit crazy so far, we're trying to adjust. We're trying to see what the new normals look like, and glad everybody's here with this weekend perspective. Again, in the remote office, so apologize if the audio is slightly different than we have on the regular Wednesday show, but was back up here in the mountains doing some work, trying to do some, help some folks out that needed some help with the, been still struggling with the hurricane. So for anybody who's, paying attention, keeping up, just so much work that still has to get done from the hurricanes in North Carolina, South Carolina, a lot in North Carolina from last fall, obviously still the fires in California. So if there's ways you can help, we're always, for those of us that are local, we're always looking for ways to help with that. And that's kind of why I'm up here for this one. And that's why the show is kind of getting recorded and publishing a little bit late. So apologize for that. But anyways, calling the show this week, Shut Up and Write Code. And the reason for that is there is a kind of a famous saying, not really famous, but kind of well recognized or well-known saying from a few years ago, in which some folks from the sports world were talking about politics, and some folks from the politics world said, hey, you folks aren't qualified to talk about politics, so please shut up and dribble, right? So essentially, stay in your lane, only do sports, we will do politics. And I think the reason I brought that up today is because it feels like maybe more so than ever, or at least more so than the last 20 years, at least 15 years since we've been doing the podcast, we're kind of reaching a point where for a long time, we very much could just focus on the technology and the companies that were driving the technology, the companies who were, or the people that were part of communities who were driving technology, while they may have had certain political leanings, left or right or middle, the politics of everything didn't have to be sort of front and center right along with the technology. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of years, and then maybe particularly with AI sort of accelerating that, we've seen that any discussion that we have around technology nowadays feels like it has a political element to it. And what I kind of want to do is explore a little bit of how we got here. And then I want to sort of make a commitment to our audience that we are going to, as much as we can, we're going to try and still focus on technology without bringing too much politics into it, right? Now, there may be times when we, for context reasons, we introduce a certain amount of, what happened from a political perspective that may have drove something. So, for example, if there is a new government regulation that comes out, it could be from the U.S., it could be from Europe, it could be from Asia Pacific, it could be from wherever. We will try and put that into context. If there is a new, restriction or something along those, a new set of guidelines come out, we will use that and try and provide context for that in as non or apolitical way that we can. But I thought it would be interesting to dive in a little bit today, and this is going to be a short show, of kind of how we got to where we are. And I think in the simplest sense of things, there's a couple of reasons, and they're pretty straightforward. And basically, if you went back 10 years, 15 years, 20 years in particular, even longer than that, we had very distinct lanes in which the companies who were building technology, originally proprietary technology, and then over time, kind of a mix of open source and proprietary technology, the companies that were participating in that, whether they were the actual creators of the technology, i.e. like vendors, or they were systems integrators of some sort, kind of had what I would call swim lanes, right? They sort of had an area that they focused upon. And it really was, it defined the technology they worked on, but it also kind of defined what their business model was, what their go-to-market route was. And what's really, I think, the biggest thing that sort of brought politics to a certain extent into all these things is that those swim lanes, the definition of those swim lanes, the sort of rigidity between individual lanes has really it's kind of become gray. And a lot of companies have moved from being purely providers of technology, purely providers of software, purely providers of hardware, into companies that, play in a lot of different areas. And not only that, but we've also seen companies who didn't originally begin in technology start to move into more technology-centric ways of interacting with the marketplace, right? And so, if we look at that and we think about that a little bit historically, the first thing that jumps to mind is you had vendors who had primarily been in the technology space, had been technology vendors. They either provided software or hardware or some combination of both. A great example of that is somebody like Oracle or Microsoft, right? Very, very distinct set of technology offerings, and eventually merged into and evolved into offering those technologies as cloud services, right? So in the case of Oracle, a set of cloud services from infrastructure through database and application. With Microsoft, again, kind of a broad mix of software services, kind of low-level primitive infrastructure as a service, SaaS types of services like Office 365, and they've acquired companies in those spaces along the line. So you had some of that, and what that introduces is you go from being the provider of technology and all the burden of things like where is the data stored, how are you complying to some regulation, was put on the customer, on the user of the technology. And when you start providing that technology, you become responsible, at least to some extent, for meeting those criteria, whether that is, worrying about where is your data stored, so do you comply with data sovereignty type of things, what type of citizens in some cases are able to access the data or work on the systems in the case of like classified government systems and so forth. So that piece of it has changed. And so, from just purely how do you get involved, are you involved with regulatory stuff? That aspect has changed. The second thing is we are starting to see consumer companies that are also enterprise companies, right? And that was a very unusual type of thing. I mean, yes, we had companies like Microsoft who provided, or IBM that provided a personal computer, but then also sold to businesses. And that was mostly the exact same product. But we are seeing, for example, like Google and Amazon, or, even Apple to a certain extent, where they have a huge number of divisions, this huge set of products that are primarily in the consumer space. And there are certain laws and regulations and things around stuff like marketplaces and other stuff that they have to comply with. But then they're also involved with the enterprise. And so you start to get into a situation of, if that company starts to, kind of get close to the line of blurring the line between, are we doing things that are sort of independent, or are we doing things that touch having to, be involved with the government of any area or region, those things start to blur together. So, for example, there are people that are looking at maybe some antitrust that's been filed against, let's say, an Apple or a Google or a Microsoft, and they're going, will the actions of these antitrust things, whether they go positively or negatively for the company, will those impact just the consumer technologies, or will they have some amount of impact on the enterprise technologies, right? So we begin to see that blurring of lines happen. The next thing is we're seeing a number of companies that are sort of tech stalwarts, tech mega companies who are involved with things that are directly impacted or involved with certain regulations, certain government things. So, for example, in the United States, there are a number of companies who do things that are tied to, for example, the First Amendment, right? One of the things that identifies what sort of speech is considered free, what sort of speech is considered sort of protected, where can the government be involved in restricting speech or not restricting speech, and that's one that kind of gets into, there's a law called Section 230 that involves, like, if you host things like message boards or things in which you're hosting a service, but people are basically bringing content to it. So like a YouTube or, a message board or, a Reddit or something along those lines, are you responsible for the speech or the actions or the implications of what goes on from your users, right? And so that's, to a certain extent, has some government regulation to it. But then you also have situations like Amazon, where Jeff Bezos, who had previously been the founder, was the CEO, is now sort of chairman emeritus, I believe. I don't know exactly what his role still is with Amazon. I think he's still chairman of the board. But he also now independently owns one of the largest newspapers in the United States. And so, he has to be concerned of, will the actions that he takes that impact politics in the world or in the United States from his independent thing, the Washington Post, could the government have some influence over how they view his company that he's the largest shareholder of, i.e. Amazon, right? So then you start to get into these sort of interesting crossovers where, the First Amendment or something like that involves speech and data comes into play. You have all of the tech companies, whether they are small companies, big companies, are trying to sell to acquire government contracts. So whether those, again, are in the United States or North America or Europe or Asia or wherever, government contracts that involve technology, are ubiquitous, right? The communication systems, the data collection systems, the networking systems, all sorts of things, whether they are military related or they're civilian related, are huge contracts. A lot of money in those types of things. So every technology company these days has some, interaction with federal governments, state and local governments around the world, and so they're having to be conscious of what's happening in the political sphere because it has potential impacts on, how they will respond to RFPs for things and so on and so forth. And then we start to get into, some other types of stuff. We saw a couple of years ago with, for example, the U.S. CHIPS Act, where a company like Intel was sort of primarily identified as being the recipient of, taxpayer funding to subsidize an industry that had, become second class from a world competitive perspective, and the U.S. government was stepping in to try and prop that up and to try and bring it back because it had, not only supply chain impacts but also national security impacts. And so, this is where you have a situation where, you could take a company like an Intel, just as an example, who hadn't necessarily been, terribly politically involved, was now sort of the center of a humongous program that was, very politically motivated, and politics and government were heavily involved for a lot of reasons. So just another example of those things. Last thing, first, like I mentioned early on, AI has sort of accelerated all this because AI is now this technology that not only touches, either touches now or will touch in the future so many potential human beings, end users of the technology, of corporations, of countries. It has the ability to be, very, very powerful if it's doing things like helping to accelerate drug discovery or accelerate cures for terrible diseases. If it's able to accelerate things like creating new materials that could have breakthrough usages for mankind and all that kind of stuff. But it also has the ability to do things in which it's used in nefarious ways, right? People talk about things like deep fakes. There was a lot of concern amongst the political class about something like AI being used for deep fakes or misinformation, generating all sorts of content, whether they are bots or content creation, whatever those things. So, it's a technology that potentially is tremendously ubiquitous. It cuts across all sorts of, human interactions, legal interactions, things like copyright, First Amendment, all sorts of things, copyright protection. There's a whole slew of them. We talked about them on the show. But it's something that, we're seeing and we have seen from, multiple, political factions and in the US and China and in Europe and so forth, trying to figure out where they should place laws, where they should place restrictions, where they should allow things, where they should try and encourage funding, in order to try and figure out what's the best way to harness this technology for the good of your country, your region, your area, whatever it might be, but also to sort of counterbalance that with the potential challenges it could have. It could have, negative impacts on employment, for example. It could have, again, negative impacts on political speech. It could have negative impacts on copyright. It could have, lots of stuff, things that have been talked about. So, I think we're going to see more and more situations, AI probably being the sort of the center of it, but we've seen it with a lot of things, right? We've seen, the EU have, lawsuits and trying to have restrictions against Apple and Microsoft and Google and others where they're trying to encourage greater competition. They're trying to prevent antitrust and anti-competitive ways. So this isn't a completely new thing, but I think at the core of it is, we have a number of entities that cross so many of those swim lanes that we didn't necessarily used to have, again, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And it's just the reality of where we are today, right? We have, multinational companies, we have multifaceted, multi-business unit, multi-usage types of businesses that are going to intersect with humanity, with governments, with local governments, with international governments. And they're going to struggle to a certain extent with, the laws in one area are going to allow them to do certain things, whereas the laws in other areas might not allow them to do things. And so I think, whether you like it or not, we are going to hear about the intersection of politics and technology, probably more so over the next 5 years, 10 years, as again, like things like AI, but mobile and lots of other things become more and more pervasive in our day-to-day life. And I think what we are going to try and do on the podcast, at least on this podcast, is we are going to do our best to, where necessary, provide to provide an overview of the politics of where the technology is being discussed for context. We're going to do the best we can to try not to convey a level of bias, whether it's conservative or liberal or somewhere in between, left and right, one or the other. We may slip on that, and we apologize for that, but it's not our intention. We know our audience, for the most part, tunes into our show to hear technology discussions, to hear about where technology is going. There are plenty of other places on the internet, whether it's YouTube or podcasts or TikTok or wherever it might be, that you can go and find much more, niche, focused, just political discussions. And if that's what you're looking for, we encourage you to go find it there. So anyways, so if you see the title of this and you see it says, shut up and write code, it's a little bit of an homage to the kerfuffle that got raised a little while ago about, shut up and play sports, that came up back in 2018. So anyways, just wanted to give you a sense of that. I don't know that I'm necessarily breaking any news here, but that's kind of the approach that I think we're going to be taking. And again, would appreciate anybody's feedback if you think that we are introducing too much politics into things, if we're not having enough discussion about politics to make the context of things useful. But, your feedback is always welcome. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Sorry for this being a little bit late. Hopefully it's useful. We've got a fun show, Cloud News of the Week, coming out on Wednesday, and we'll be cranking into a lot of fun stuff in February. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.